Hello there. Now you're probably thinking, wait a minute, this guy's not Cask Theology. You'd be correct. I am not Cask Theology. I am the Mythology Guy. This video was made in collaboration with Cask Theology. He made a video over on my channel, if you haven't guessed by now, it's Mythology Guy, which you can go watch after watching this video. Okay, so to me there are two sets of Jesus' followers. There are the main guys, who wrote the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then there's also Peter, Jesus' best friend, and Judas the betrayer. But that's only 6, and there are 12 disciples in total. The other 6 are James, Bartholomew, another James, another Judas, Philip, and the guy we're going to talk about, Thomas. Boy, did Thomas have a big life. Not much is known about him before he linked up with Jesus and his followers. He was a very devoted member of the disciples, however, even though, ironically, most people think of him for that time he doubted the resurrection. You know Jesus' famous line, "I am the way, the truth, and the life"? He was saying that to answer Thomas's question, "Where are we going, Master?" Jesus was talking about how he was going to die and resurrect, but Thomas didn't understand, and he wanted to follow Jesus to where he was physically going. Thomas didn't know where Jesus was going, but he did say before that he would die for Christ, so that shows just how devoted Thomas was to Jesus. Unfortunately for Thomas, the thing most people associate with him is the saying, "a doubting Thomas." The phrase came about after the resurrection. Mary and some of the others were saying that Jesus had returned, but Thomas insisted, saying, "Unless I can see the nail holes and stick my hand in his side, I will not believe it." Wouldn't you know, a week later, he got the chance to stick his finger in Jesus' spear wound. He proclaimed his faith right there, and Jesus gave him a slight roast before ascending to heaven not long after. And just like that, Thomas vanishes from the New Testament, but not from history. He may have some other written works of his own. Another fact about Thomas is that he shares the same name as the supposed author of the Sayings Gospel of Thomas. This gospel isn't like the main 4, and it's not a narrative of Jesus' life, but rather a collection of sayings Jesus supposedly said. Andrew Mark Henry over at Religion for Breakfast has a great video that goes into much more depth about this, which I highly recommend you go watch after watching my video and Cask's video on my channel. You might have noticed I said he's the supposed author of the Sayings Gospel. Most scholars agree it probably wasn't written by the Thomas we're talking about, given how whenever a church official did mention it, they condemned it. Still an interesting read though. There is also another book called The Acts of St. Thomas. This book goes into much more depth about his missions in India, but I'll be drawing more from the oral history given by the St. Thomas Christians themselves. Nevertheless, it's still an interesting read, and I probably will touch upon it in the future video. And if you want to learn about something that Thomas we're talking about actually did you know Thomas traveled and preached the gospel in India? I know, right? Of all countries, you wouldn't expect India to have an early Christian population, would you? Well, they do, and it's entirely independent of the Catholic and Orthodox churches of Europe and the Middle East, because of the distance between them. Because of this, they have their own schisms and their own influences from the much larger religion, Hinduism. The story goes, and I say story because there aren't any written records from the time period, but there is an oral tradition, that after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ, the disciples split up to convert people. Most stayed in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, but some branched off and went on adventures, like Paul's missionary journeys and Thomas's voyage to India. Thomas likely left Jerusalem and traveled down the Arabian Peninsula before boarding a trade ship to India. Thomas landed in Kerala in 52 AD and started preaching the word of God there. As time went on, he established several other churches in Kerala and the surrounding regions. As time went on, the Christian community grew in Kerala. They never became a majority, but they got a sizable minority. Thomas wanted to bring the gospel elsewhere, so he left the Christian communities he established and traveled to the Indian state next door. Here, though, these people were not as keen to hear the word of God, and they tried to assassinate him. Thomas tried running back to Kerala, but the assassins eventually caught up to him and rammed a spear through Thomas, making him a martyr for the faith. His final words, according to the Acts of Thomas, were the same words he said when he saw Jesus after the resurrection. "My Lord, my God." He was murdered at a place now called St. Thomas Mount. Now that's the end of St. Thomas, but his ministry lived on. The Christians at Kerala lived their usual lives as a minority, but eventually more Christians came to the city. These were Christians from the Persian Empire who were likely escaping persecution. These guys really left a mark on the St. Thomas Christians. One of the most noticeable examples of this is that the sermons are done in Syriac, which is a dialect from the Middle East. Despite being a minority, the St. Thomas Christians were treated very well by others in Kerala. They were also incorporated into India's caste system, and they weren't even that low in the social order either. Things were going pretty well for them. But then the Portuguese arrived. Now, if you remember from world history class, the Portuguese were sailing around Africa to try and find a trade route to India, and wouldn't you know, they found it. One of the first places they landed in India was Kerala, and you can imagine their surprise when they found Christians there. However, they weren't Catholic, so the Portuguese didn't consider them real Christians because of all the Persian and Hindu influences on their Christianity, such as the Syriac sermons and placed in a caste system I just mentioned. This European influence changed a lot of the churches in Kerala. A few of the churches adopted a Latin-style mass, and many of the people converted to Roman Catholicism away from St. Thomas's Christianity. Some of the St. Thomas Christians were reasonably afraid their faith would die out, so they tried to rebel against the Portuguese. If you know anything about European colonialism though, you know these rebellions rarely work. The Latin influence made its way in, and now it's here to stay. Don't worry though, because a lot of the St. Thomas Christians still keep their original traditions going, along with the Persian and the now Portuguese influenced ones. Okay, so some people would say because the earliest records of Christianity in India only go back to the 200s, that means Thomas never traveled to India, and his missions were just a legend. I want to rebuttal that though. You see, when the Portuguese realized that St. Thomas Christians had a lot of Hindu influences, they rounded up as many documents as they could and burned them all to try and stamp out what they saw as heresy. As a result, a lot of the early church's history is lost to time. On top of that, oral tradition has been around for centuries at least, and we know there's some validity to it. Also keep in mind that India was on the Silk Road, so it's not crazy to think that one of the disciples would travel east. Oh, and by the way, the Catholic Church has since gone back on the whole St. Thomas Christians are a heresy thing. The Pope even visited them and made Thomas the patron saint of India, so it's a happy story in the end. There's so much more to the St. Thomas Christians that I didn't talk about here, like how exactly are they connected to Hinduism and other Indian cultural influences on their religion, but I think this video has gone on long enough. Thank you for watching, and thank you to Cask Theology for being my first collab. If you want to see what he's doing, you can go over to my channel. He's talking about different gods of beer in different mythologies. Go check it out. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe to Cask Theology for more theological and beer-related content. If you want to see more of me, head over to my channel, Mythology Guy. As of recording this, I'm nearing 300 subscribers, so I would really love it if you subscribed. I hope to see you there. Have a good one.